Hello, everyone. I hope that this is currently recording. We had some technical difficulties last Friday, so I'm recording this for viewing and hopefully we'll discuss it later on. I do want to start off with a little advance notice that in this session, when I talk about history, it will include discussions of violence, violence against women, coercion, death, and rape. I won't be going into detail, but I will be touching on the awful parts of the transition from feudalism to capitalism, exactly because in our stories of who we are and how we got here and where we're going, the invisible violence is part of the problem we are trying to address when we say we want things like justice and a livable future. So for my whole life, I feel like I've been thinking about change, what causes social change, and perhaps more importantly, what prevents change from happening. We've been told as individuals, as countries, as a global community, told by the people who have been entrusted as their society's knowledge keepers, by which I mean scientists and scholars. We were told by these people we trust that we were in danger and we needed to change things about our big collective lives. And scientists have this one job, to produce knowledge as a contribution to the public good. And they did their job, and we didn't do much in response, and we still haven't. And this disconnect has kept me thinking about change for most of my life since. So talking about change and theories of change could be a whole year's worth of long talks, and I'm distilling this down to what I hope is an interesting journey. I want to quickly acknowledge that me talking about change includes a lot of intersecting disciplines, and I am not an expert in everything. So I'm up for a discussion about a lot of this. Some of where I'm landing with ideas about change will probably evolve as conversations keep happening and we all figure out what is useful to us in this process. So I'm going to talk about learning, science, knowledge, how we think of change itself. I'm going to talk about the last time societies around the world were transformed from feudal societies to capitalism we live in today. And then I'll talk about democratic participation in making change and why understanding our own approach to change is so important in co-creating a livable, just future. So now I'm going to share my screen and hope that this works. All right. Share. Okay. And I'm pressing play. And hopefully it will start to play my slideshow. Okay, here we go. So, what is a theory of change? It is how we think about change. How does change occur? Who gets to make change? Why do things change? What kinds of changes are transformative? What things are possible to change? How fast can change occur? And where do we fit in? Whether we are aware of it or not, we all have answers to these questions, but we rarely sit with them and ponder how these shape the way we act in the world. These questions get to the core of what we believe about the world itself, how we see ourselves in society, and more. And these questions are different at different scales and in different circumstances. For instance, a mountain cannot change into a beach in a day, but a doctor tells you to stop eating gluten because that's what's causing your troubles, and you'll stop that very moment, probably. So some examples of official theories of change are panarchy, multiple streams theory is a theory of policy change. There's the crisis theory of change as described in the shock doctrine. Maybe non-official theories of change would be education and most laws in physics. So science is overwhelmingly about studying change and how we think of change, how we understand it. I have been asked whether I'm a scientist when I say that I do research, and I've hesitated to say yes because I think of scientists as running experiments in a lab, but that's just a very specific kind of science. Um, Scientists broadly study change and study the world we all share. So, of course, I'm a scientist, and truly, we all have a bit of scientist in us. Some may say that my statement about science is a bit big, that science is really a specific methodology. And certainly, Western institutional traditions of science focus heavily on the method of studying change. There's a lot more to be said about this, but I'm going to say that we are all often studying change and engaging with knowledge, and laboratories are not the only place that science happens. But all of this knowledge itself doesn't create change. Learning does. And a definition of learning that I was taught is that you bring knowledge into yourself and something you do changes. And that is learning. It is applied knowledge. In this way, education is a theory of change, whether it is changing the way you think, the way that you see the world, the things that you do. The learning must affect change in action. Otherwise, it is not learning, it is just knowledge sitting around without effect. So, on the one hand, at a societal level, when we think about all the knowledge produced by climate scientists, a lot of individuals have learned from them, even some communities, and they've changed their actions. But on the whole, we don't see a change in our emissions trajectory. We don't see a change in society's overall effect on the environment. So if we need a society level change, which might be reframed as society level learning, how does society learn from all the knowledge produced for the public good, as in the case of climate scientists, which is to say, how does society change? So not all change is the same in quality or quantity. Change doesn't always come from empowered learning. Sometimes it comes from adapting to hardship. Change can be by choice or force or coercion. I have changed in a lot of ways that I don't like very much and were not something that I had a choice about. And I have changed in ways that I'm excited about and are empowering. Like that feeling when you read a book and you never look at the world in the same way again, or the moment that you learn how to do something new and you are a changed person. So change that is empowering comes from learning that is relational and is about belonging. So there is a charming indigo bunting family living in a bramble patch by my house. I like to go check on the little chicks because they are so strange and wonderful, but this doesn't make the parents too happy. An example of relational learning is that I don't want to stress out these birds. I consider them beings I share a forest with, and I listen to the pitch and pace of their call. And when it goes from, I see you near my nest, to you are too close, I back off. I change my behavior. If I was engaged in adaptation as learning, I maybe wouldn't be listening. And then I would be dive bombed by a very beautiful, angry small bird until I had to adapt and change because it was dangerous for me to continue. Now, if I was engaged in extractive learning, I would not be listening to them. And I would be in that nest with my camera, thinking about all the knowledge I was gathering from seeing these chicks so close up while making the parents very upset. And the thing that I would change, resulting change might be just that I had a new anecdote about seeing bunting chicks up close. And there's, of course, a lot of overlap in these categories, as in life. We adapt to our environment all the time, and that can be relational learning. We are not being coerced by winter into wearing wool hats, even if we sometimes feel this way. Relational learning can be adaptation, sorry. But importantly, when we think of climate change, it is often said that we will make changes either by design or by disaster. And the problem with change as adaptation is that we are not empowered in this process. And the folks around the world already adapting to the climate disruption, they have to adapt. This is coercive change. They don't have agency in this process. If we want to be empowered in the climate era, we need to engage in relational learning now before we are in a state of constant adaptation. The response to the coronavirus, the lockdowns, the social distancing, this is adaptation. If governments around the world had listened to epidemiologists years ago and prepared better, we might have had the opportunity that we do with climate change to have changes that are empowering, that would have been voluntary and consensual. So currently, we are not learning from all of the climate knowledge because knowledge isn't learning itself. So how do we learn as societies and incorporate new information into our livelihoods and our economies? So first, we have to ask what society is at all, because this is deeply politicized. Neoliberalism, which is a free market political ideology that seeks to limit the ability of government to affect capitalist markets and to remove regulations that affect those so-called free markets. Importantly, the liberalism part of this is heavily focused on the individual person, to the extent that what I call society is merely considered to be a given number of individuals just added up. Margaret Thatcher famously said that society does not exist. This is a really politically useful idea because it removes any levers besides the individual person through which we can learn and thus change. It naturalizes a power dynamic which will benefit those who already hold disproportionate power. So the society definition I am using comes from the idea of that communities or communities living with shared customs or laws and organizational sort of structures. The term comes from Latin and is related to companion, which has roots in sharing bread. So I frame that a lot as having an economic relationship. So the definition I use is a society is a group whose livelihoods are recognized to be intertwined. So how can we change society if at the policy level, society is denied as a thing at all, let alone a scale of social and relational learning? To look at this, we are going to explore how society has changed in the past. And we are going to talk about the end of feudalism in Europe and the beginning of capitalism. This was a massive change in society, a transformation, and was in many ways a process of adaptation to multiple crises and the resistance to radical new social changes that were being proposed. So one of the best things about history or learning history is seeing how changes happened and realizing that things which are sometimes confusing actually make sense if they are placed in context. So this might seem out of left field, but we're going to start here with a quote from 1992 from Pat Robertson, a TV evangelist who had a decent amount of popularity and political sway at that time. This sort of thing here that you see on the slide, where it says, feminism encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians. So I found that very confusing when I was younger. It just did not make sense to me that women's rights were equated with destroying capitalism or child murder or witchcraft. I couldn't understand why anybody cared about what I chose to do with my life or my body, especially in a liberal democracy. So this combination of accusations didn't make sense until I learned about something called primitive accumulation. And this was a crucial part of the transformation of society from feudalism to capitalism. I've also just noted here that all of these accusations are all related to reproduction, either implicitly or explicitly. So primitive accumulation is the process of accumulating the means of production, called capital, to start capitalist society. Generally was in the form of land and bodies. So before anyone had money to invest in a venture or business or whatever, they needed that startup money. Once that capital is in the cycle of investment and production and markets and profit, it's just considered to be capital in its own capital accumulation cycles. But that startup accumulation has to come from outside of the capitalist system. It was wealth that had to be converted into forms of capital that could be used within capitalist systems of production. And how that happened is really important to remember because it was part of building a foundation for a new society. And a lot of what we think of as just normal cultural stuff today come from that time period, from about 1300 to 1800. So there is an excellent book called Caliban and the Witch, written by Silvia Federici. There's more information on the website, as well as some good resources that relate to it and the rest of this talk. But this book is an incredible dive into the creation of the gendered division of labor. A lot of what we think of as patriarchy, the claiming of the female body as a natural resource, essentially because it produces workers, and the institutional creation of racial difference as a form of primitive capital accumulation. So it is a counterpart to a lot of other work, which demonstrates how important colonialism is, or colonialism was, to primitive accumulation, in being able to concentrate wealth and power to enable widespread capitalist production and the beginning of an entirely new kind of society. So I'm going to take you on a journey through the transformation of society from feudalism to capitalism. Capitalism is considered to be an economic and political system in which production and trade and industry are controlled by private owners, and where goods and services are produced in order to make a profit. This was a radical change from feudalism, which began because the Roman version of slavery could no longer continue because so many slaves were running away that it was affecting food production. So people who had been slaves were transformed into serfs and given new legal rights and duties. Feudalism was the system where large plots of land, or manors, were granted to knights or nobles in exchange for military service to the king. And then on these manors, serfs were given access to land in exchange for goods and services that they produced from those lands. So serfdom is the relationship in which serfs work the land of the lord of a manor in exchange for being able to work some of that land for themselves. They were bound to the land instead of to a person. And they worked that land, but they had to stay put. And this was meant to be an improvement, and it sort of was. It mostly resolved the food production problems across Europe. And there was some stability as feudalism, as the organizing logic of medieval society took hold. Though there was still struggle and tension. A number of anti-natalist movements began all around Europe in about 1000 Common Era. And anti-natalist means that people were managing their own fertility and were preventing birth if they wanted to. So the Christian church, which was a core institution in Europe at the time, responded to these anti-natalist movements by making marriage a sacrament and condemning homosexuality because it was non-reproductive sex. But even as pairing off and having children was encouraged, the church didn't claim that abortion was a sin. Abortion for economic reasons was actually acceptable within the church doctrine, reasonable even. It was only considered a sin if it was within a case of infidelity, and that was where the sin came from. So the church was really fine with reproductive interventions like abortion until after the Black Plague hit in about 1350, which happened after there was quite a terrible famine and a third of the population of Europe died. And this shifted power relations because of the massive shortage of labor. The system of feudalism to sustain itself was under threat. As an attempt to manage the threat to the status quo that this labor shortage represented, there were attempts to legalize slavery in Italy, the setting of a maximum wage in England, because workers could, of course, ask for much higher wages due to the lack of workers. And all over Europe, there were peasant rebellions that were crushed with intense vigor. I am talking about Europe here, but there were peasant rebellions going on all over Asia and Africa as well, because feudalism and land bondage still sucked. But power did shift as it had to with this much smaller workforce, and it meant a better life for peasants. They had greater access to land with their new negotiating power. Land bondage mostly disappeared, and they became free farmers, and they were well fed. They were needed by the lords, and the wages tripled in much of Europe, and food prices went down. Pretty quickly, the old guard of the old power structures to say the lords, the royals, the clergy were all freaked right out. And this is when the enclosures began and when heresy became tied to what were called reproductive crimes. And the witch trials really got going. Rape was effectively decriminalized in many parts of Europe. Brothels became sanctioned by the church as a public good, as a cure for homosexuality, which again, the problem with that was that there was not reproductive sex happening, all because they wanted more people. And by people, I mean laborers. So enclosures is something I'm going to define here. This was a process of eliminating the common lands used by these free peasants for subsistence agriculture. The land that they had had access to suddenly became cut off, literally with hedges and fences by the lords. This forced peasants into the cities where they needed to work for wages because they no longer had access to common land for farming. And this is key to what changed in the shift from feudalism to capitalism. Before, the labor that peasants, the vast majority of the population in Europe and the world, the labor that they engaged in was socially sustaining and regenerative. They were growing what they needed to directly survive and meet their needs. Working for a wage meant that they had to enter into a different relationship with work. Today, we say that productive work is work done for wages that produce commodities or goods or services for sale. Productive work and meeting one's needs used to be the same thing. Now, suddenly, productive work and the work of meeting one's needs became separate actions because they were separated from a process of working to make a wage in order to then go and purchase what you needed to meet your needs. So then the Reformation happened, which doubled the workday and introduced the very useful Protestant work ethic, where it was essentially sanctified to work as hard as you could. Enclosures increased, and then in the mid-1500s, more famines hit and the population declined again. And this is when the witch hunts really escalated and the social control of reproduction intensified. Women across Europe had to register their pregnancies. By 1650s, most of England had been enclosed, and the peak era of the witch hunts sort of ending at the end of the 1600s because the peasants had lost. A gendered division of labor was created in which women's bodies had been redefined as reproducers of the labor force, and a very particular form of acceptable femininity that was nurturing, virtuous, and caring had come to replace the not on board with capitalism witches. So whether you may or may not know about the witch hunts, it is that they had a very specific social purpose that had not very much to do with whether you think magic is real or that the church was truly afraid of magic. A pared down lens of a witch is someone who does not partake in all of the social norms required for the sustaining of market capitalism. Witch discourse today still calls out and identifies this very specific otherness. Sometimes I playfully replace witch with non-capitalist when I hear witches talked about or referred to, and the purpose of witch discourse becomes clear. But there are still witch hunts happening today in parts of the world doing exactly what they did back in this transformation of society towards capitalism. They enforce the expansion of market capitalism, whether people want it or not, hand in hand with coalitions of religious social institutions. Current witch hunts happening today are in Papua New Guinea and Nepal. But the old witch hunts, women were leading revolts, food revolts and rebellions against the enclosures, mostly because they were more vulnerable to poverty and famine than peasant men who had legal access to money that women did not have access to in many parts of Europe. Being excluded from wages in many places made it so that the famines were felt more deeply by women, who then led revolts. These revolts were destabilizing, and so these women and some men were removed from society through witch hunts. The peak times for this were the 1500s to the 1600s, and the hunts were absolutely key to defeating the European peasantry who were resisting the enclosure process, which could be restated as resisting the privatization of agricultural land. Between 50,000 and 1,000,000 people were executed in terrible and multiple ways for not following the new social norms, and 80% of these people were women. Essentially, the witch hunts were an opportunity to call out mostly women for being single, for not being docile, for any attempts to control reproduction, for living alone. And this discourse became embedded in the churches, in the social sphere, and became a way of policing norms. This is perhaps similar today to the way that terrorism has come to take on whatever meaning it needs to fit the political desires of those in power. Today, protesting a pipeline can be called terrorism, for instance. The idea of a witch was merely a tool that a coalition of the powerful used to meet their economic goals, and they were super successful. The population did go up. Peasants became overwhelmingly dependent on wages earned in cities in order to survive. What is important to note is that the actions of this coalition of nobility, clergy, emerging merchant class made sense to them at the time. Feudalism was failing and nobody really knew what was coming next, but it was clear that the power structures that existed were deeply under threat. Peasant rebellions and the general high well-being of peasants after the plague, but before the enclosures and witch hunts, made it seem like a different world and power structure, a different system was possible. So while the witch hunts and the enclosures transformed the people of Europe into labor capital and privatized the land, around the world, capital was extracted as resources, land was claimed through violence, and labor was extracted as slavery or indentured servitude. Colonialism, the witch hunts, and the expropriation of land were all critical aspects of starting capitalism. The female body was appropriated as a commons, as a natural resource, and femininity was constructed by the state and social institutions for economic ends. The construction of this economic woman as a machine of natural reproduction is just that, a construction, because it was too difficult to manage a population otherwise. Women's agency was a market failure that was getting in the way of market expansion and a proper labor market. So a group of powerful men changed society until women's ability to disrupt the labor market was not significant enough to destabilize a system that they liked to be in charge of. So capitalism became the organizing logic of societies around the world. But just as famine and population crises threatened feudalism, right now climate change threatens capitalism. Economics are critical to the organizing logic of society because it is how we meet our needs and survive. I have often thought of culture as the language of survival, and culture is deeply intertwined with economics because economic rules are agreements and relationships in the public sphere with other people. Pardon me. So when I say that market capitalism is the organizing logic of many of our societies, I mean that regardless of our charming regional differences, we reinforce, agree to, and recreate certain rules of behavior in our efforts to survive together and to meet our needs and to create a livelihood. But our way of life, particularly in longer-lived capitalist societies, has become so energy intense that we are faced with the disruption of the Earth's life support systems in the form of climate change and the global ecological crisis. Societal transformation happens when the previous version of society cannot be sustained into the future. This ability to sustain society includes both very specific physical and material factors like access to energy sources, food, resources, but also social factors like resistance movements and institutions. So as an example, we have these amazing and also vulnerable bodies. We need a bunch of calories and minerals and clothing and love and sunshine and water and other things. If we don't sustain these parts of ourselves, we can't sustain ourselves into the future. One day our bodies won't be able to sustain ourselves and we will die. Climate change, for instance, threatens our ability to sustain society as it currently is. Changing society is choosing what kind of future we want, what we want to build. This is something most human communities have been doing since we have been human, learning and changing how we are in the world and what indeed that world looks like. So capitalism as the organizing factor of society is no longer able to sustain capitalism, and it is scary to be in the throes of crisis because within this cultural space, uncertainty feels like risk. It feels hazardous, it feels scary, and it feels like it threatens our ability to survive. And what comes next is not clear. This is where we have opportunities to not merely adapt, but to change through relational, society level, and personal learning to see how we can belong in the global community of life, belong in the ecologies that we are part of, instead of forcing this community of life to adapt to us, which is what's happening now. Or very soon we will confront being forced to adapt to the changes in the Earth's life support systems. If we continue as we are, which is to say, pursuing society level goals like economic growth in GDP that are currently tied to emissions growth and ecological collapse, we will be forced to change as adapting to a new climate. If we seek to belong in the ecologies, in the land, the community of life on Earth, we must re-envision what it looks like for us to belong and what the organizing logic of our societies, by extension, our economy must be. This will be a cultural change because it will be how we survive together and thrive. So major debates in academia and elsewhere are about what is capitalism and is constant growth inherent to capitalism? Can you keep society as it is, or do we have to change the rules? How much do we have to change in order to not produce more climate change and more ecological crisis? So green growth and the associated rhetoric of eco-modernism is all aimed at somehow saving capitalism as the organizing logic of society. They are attempts to retain capitalism while also solving the big problem that is climate change. There's very little evidence to support that this is a possibility. Where I land in this right now is that there are certainly ways to imagine our economy, including markets in some fashion, but markets can no longer make up the majority of our social world. Our society can no longer be a market society. We cannot be reliant on constantly growing economic markets as the source of our livelihood. Conversations about population control are also about not having to change society. The idea being that if there are just less people, then the impact of all our economic growth will be smaller and we won't have to change. I will post some resources on the website about why this is a terrible discussion to get into. Both population growth and population control and green growth discourse are attempts to change some parts of society while maintaining current power and social structures. They are changed through extractive learning, in which science and innovation are wielded as tools for a non-consensual, non-participatory process of change. So this is a quote that I quite like. Assuming that we do collectively make our world and that we continue to remake it daily, then why is it that we somehow end up with a world so few of us like, most find unjust, and under which none of us feels any ultimate control? So there are a lot of interesting and meaningful conversations to be had about democracy these days. However, I am only going to speak about one aspect that I think is not brought up enough, and that is who gets to build the world. So I am going to tell a quick story about an AI, artificial intelligence presentation that I attended. It had a Q&A period afterwards. It was at McGill. It was a pretty interesting presentation with a range of people in attendance. After a bunch of normal questions, a soft-spoken young undergrad wearing leggings and a pink McGill hoodie got up and talked about AI in movies, and she fangirled a little bit about Scarlett Johansson in her AI movie. And I admit that I was sort of rolling my eyes. And then this young person asked one of the most interesting questions I've heard in a long time and that I think about regularly. She wondered why AI was even a goal. She said, it's generally accepted that this is just where society is moving and that tech has always been evolving in this way. And she pointed out that We all buy the products because we have to. We use technology that's put in front of us, and all this money flows into the bank accounts of these few tech companies, and then they make decisions about the direction of society. They are not elected, but because they think AI is the future, it becomes the future for all of us. She asked if it wasn't disingenuous to talk about the future of society as though it was a natural process and not a small group of tech billionaires leading us all down a path we didn't choose, filled with innovations nobody asked for, but through which they will make even more money and determine which next direction we all go. So they did not have an answer for her, but I have been thinking about who shapes society ever since. I mean, I would say I've always been thinking about who shapes society, but she really clarified the process for me. I'm very grateful for her. So economists will tell us that markets are participatory, that we make the world with our purchases, also known as demand. That producers make what we demand, and so whatever they do is for us and is thus our responsibility. They make the world for us, so we should be happy that our needs have been met. At least this is the theory. From an individual perspective, in terms of climate, the use of statistics to divide national emissions by population makes it seem like we are each personally responsible for climate change. And this is not entirely wrong, but it's not the whole picture at all. Because of the way in which financialization, by which I mean the increasing role of financial motives, financial markets, financial actors and institutions in the operation of domestic and international economies, because of financialization, the perceived relationship between supply and demand is no longer as tight as it is theoretically supposed to be. It is investment and trading in securities that affects price and quantity on the marketplace. Some companies don't even need to sell their actual product or make a profit to make money in the long run because they have hedged their risk in securities markets. So right now, investment guides supply, not demand. And though many would say that this is just a market failure, I would say that it is financial market realism. So while it would be great to think that we could just make a different consumer choice and thus change the economy, if we want the emissions intense form of production and trade to voluntarily change within the 10-year window to address climate action, we need to understand that it is not individual consumer action that affects the manner of production. If we don't do this now, we will change via adaptation to a brave new climate. And there are a lot of memes on the internet that try to say that we don't get to criticize the tar sands because we like to drive a car or like to eat berries in the winter. If we are reliant on or even love our cars, we must be hypocrites. But the realist part of this is that we can't actually choose something different. If we're going to be very honest, the thing that stresses me out the most about being a person is that almost everything I do in order to survive comes at the cost of someone or something else. That the way the global economy is set up is such that if I want a sandwich, it is tied, pardon me, that if I want a sandwich, it is tied to the pollution of a river, the disenfranchisement of a farmer, the abuse and suffering of animals directly and indirectly, the burning of fossil fuels, and the fact that I probably made some rich old European man even richer because I was hungry for a sandwich. I don't like that meeting my own needs means someone else who has very little power already gives up more of their power and transfers it to somebody who is already very powerful. And I don't like that if I want to participate in society, I don't have an option to choose something besides reinforcing this form of market capitalism. Because within capitalism, you can still only choose more capitalism. But I also want to refer back to a very powerful quote from our last speaker last month, Krista Demore-Flute, who said, "We must understand disengagement isn't an allowed option, and then choose it anyways." So the only acceptable form of demand in a society based on market capitalism is consumer demand. We are politically understood to be individuals first, consumers second, constituents third, and that's it, unless we are, of course, shareholders, which some of us are through pensions or whatnot. Um, these are the forms of demand that are allowable within our political and economic systems. We are told to make change by voting, by buying differently, by joining boards and voting this way or that, because our knowledge traditions in the West see society as mere groupings of individuals. We don't have a lot of systems in place to be seen or make demands as communities, as ecologies, as kin. We don't have an economy that allows for democratic and ecological sustaining of society. Think of the systematic dismantling of unions that was a real neoliberal policy goal. Unions are a lot of things, but they are one of the last examples of a form of making demands in a method larger than the individual. Being a consumer, however, is only one kind of relationship we have with the world around us. We have a lot of other relationships to land, to people, to other beings, to the future. Figuring out how to practice democratic governance and participation that makes these many relations visible is part of honoring our whole self and our ecological place in the world. So if you find yourself looking at people protesting in the street and thinking, they're not making change the right way, we must remember that the only socially allowable forms of making change is as consumers and voters. Protesters will always look bad or radical or a bit other because of trying to make change outside of these tightly constrained roles. In fact, street protests are a pretty good indication that constraining our democratic identity as mere consumers or voters is insufficient for participation in creating change. So final point before I start to wrap it up, I've heard all sorts of things described as natural and normal and part of human biology in much of my life, that women are naturally better at care work, or that men's violence against women is from a biological state of having more testosterone, that racism is natural because humans don't like people who look different from them, that capitalism is a phase of human economic evolution that emerged naturally when feudalism failed. To claim that something is natural is to say that we can't change it without going against nature. There is a desire to define the human in such a way that we do not focus our desire for change on certain parts of ourselves and our society, so that we see the society we live in today as the pinnacle of evolution, as flawed as it is, instead of a deeply constructed through pathways of history, power, economics, and struggle. The idea of the Anthropocene, defined as a geological era in which human activity has had a significant impact on the planet, lumps all of humanity in one swoop and suggests that we all caused climate change together because it is human nature. We couldn't have not caused it eventually. That it is biological to expand until we are forced to adapt through suffering. This is an explicitly political framing. There is so much energy and investment dollars directed towards defining boundaries around what is our nature and what is not. And a lot of it is done in the field of evolutionary psychology and influenced by neo-Darwinist ideas of evolution. And the social purpose of all of this research about who we are and what is natural and what is not natural, the purpose of this is to limit the scope of what we can imagine changing about ourselves and our societies. The fundamental question becomes, what do you think a human being is? Questions about gender essentialism, about sexism, about racism and ecology, all of these are part of political discourses to prevent certain types of change, to make us think that some things are not changeable. There was a time when I believed the research that tried to tell me that women are more suited to care work than men, or that women were more nurturing by nature. Denying the effects of culture and society on ourselves and who we think we are is about preventing deep change to a system that privileges some over others. But I hope that some of touching upon the history of the creation of the gendered workforce revealed that a lot of our ideas about what is natural came from a really intense struggle for creating a new society as the last one failed. I am not here to tell you what the nature of the human is, But I will say that many folks who are trying to tell you what is natural and what is unnatural are trying to control the conversation about what we can and can't change in this time of transformation. So, what is the human? What is society? And what can we change? What is the story about ourselves that we believe? I am going to leave you with this statement that capitalism was not inevitable, it was created. Colonialism was not inevitable, it was created. Climate change was not inevitable, it was created. And this should be an empowering statement, because knowing that this society that we live in and this world we create is made by people might help us tap into the outrage at what is being done in our names, the outrage at having to participate in recreating this world and be able to imagine building a different world. It means we can make massive change when we need to. Last month, our talk was about imagining anti-colonial futures, and some of the ideas were really big and challenged us to think about really different ways of engaging with the world around us. I hope that this talk made it feel possible to understand ourselves as capable of big change and capable of imagining the changes that are required for us if we are to be able to learn from not just climate scientists who have been banging on about the same thing for decades now, but also learning from ecosystems and people in our communities who are trying to communicate that changes need to be made for us to create a future together. And I want to ask all of us to really sit with our own desire for change, our assumptions about change, and our fears, and see where that takes us. I will leave you with the question, what does it look like for us to belong, not just as individuals, but as societies of people whose livelihoods are recognized to be intertwined? What does the organizing logic of our society and economy and culture look like? Right now, the organizing logic of market capitalist societies approach the world as belonging to us. We have a short amount of time to imagine what the organizing logic of society would look like if we instead belong in a global community of life, of land, of ecologies, of many beings. What will the rules of our economy or how we meet our needs be if we belong in the world instead of the world belonging to us? So thank you. And I look forward to discussing this with folks. We will be setting up a Zoom time to talk more deeply about this if we like. And I look forward to seeing you all then. I'm going to stop share somehow, maybe. Maybe not. Interesting. And hopefully this actually recorded. Anyways, I'm still here. I'm going to keep talking until I can get to the right screen. So thanks. See you on the internet.